Hi, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1064th New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the joy today of being your MC for a conversation featuring Diedrick Brackens and Glenn Adamson. And I'll now introduce our guest and host. Diedrick Brackens explores the intersection of identity and socio-political issues by creating hand-woven tapestries that re-examine allegory and narrative through material, autobiography, and broader themes of African American and queer identity, American history, and memory. Bracken's recent solo shows include Craft Contemporary Los Angeles, Oakville Galleries Ontario, and the New Museum New York. He's the recipient of the U.S. Artist Fellowship 2021, among many other recognitions. And our host today, Glenn Adamson, is a curator, writer, and historian based in New York and London. Dr. Adamson's most recent publication is Craft and American History. Dr. Adamson is editor of Material Intelligence, a quarterly online journal published by the Chipstone Foundation, and curator at large for Longhouse Reserve. His next book, A Century of Tomorrows, will be out with Bloomsbury in December 2024. Diedrick and Glenn, thanks so much for joining us today, and I'm thrilled to pass it over to you, Glenn, to get us started.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. Hello, Diedrick.
Hey, hey.
Great to see you coming in from the Bay Area today. I am in London, so we got a little bit of a time zone span. And this is actually the first time we've had a chance to converse since 2020, when I had the privilege of writing on your work for Art in America. So it's great to be reconnected. I was looking back at that article and remembered that actually it was written on the occasion of what should have been a show at Jack Shainman then, but of course it did not happen because of what we all know of, the pandemic. And so it's fantastic that we're now gathered to talk about a show that is very much up and to be seen at Jack Shainman in his new space, which is called Blood Compass. We might as well go ahead and start looking at some images because they are so stunning. Not just the space, which is amazing, but obviously the work. And I feel like a lot has accumulated in this exhibition. I feel like there's threads that go back not only in your earlier work, but much deeper into history and into literature. And I'm sure we'll get into all of that. But I thought we might start just by talking about the exhibition title, Blood Compass, and where it comes from. Always a good way to begin.
Absolutely. Thank you for being in conversation with me, and thank you, Brooklyn Well, for having me. But the title Blood Compass is something that, I don't know, came out of nowhere in one sense, but also I think through like an interest in a thousand things. But I originally was sort of fixating on migration as sort of like the thing that humans do across and around the globe, but also really thinking about animals. And I kind of got fixated on this idea of instinct and thinking about um, if that registers in the body of an animal rather than like just in the mind, or like where does instinct sit? And I kept thinking about this idea that uh, one of the sort of like elemental parts of blood is iron. And so I was really thinking about like, is somehow that iron in the blood um, influencing how an animal might find true north, or, decide when to go and where to go. Um, and of course, I sort of overlaid that back on the human and thinking about like what maybe on some sort of metaphysical level or like literal material level is the blood in our body sort of like moving us to do or go or be. Um, and I think some of the imagery that happens in the show was really thinking about navigation or blood or both. So it was really kind of like pushing these two things together.
Right. So we're already in deep territory, but that's fine. We're probably going to stay there. Uh, so what that makes me think about is the idea of a homing instinct. And these stories about like a dog that somehow gets lost miles away
Mhm.
and finds its family or these amazing birds that are able to somehow navigate over thousands of miles, right? And I feel like that idea of home is quite important in your work, and the idea of a territory that's inhabited. In fact, if we go back to that last slide, Eleanor, if you don't mind, this is a perfect example of what I'm thinking about, because there we have this motif that, although it's not quilted, it's obviously woven, but refers to a traditional quilting pattern. And then you have the figure centered in this extraordinary pose, spread out, crouching.
Mhm.
Often I find your poses quite difficult to read. They sort of oscillate between um, ecstasy and pain, and can be read in a lot of different ways, very multivalent, but they are very much occupying space. And I'd love to hear you talk about just that basic compositional question of how you approach putting the figure at home in the image.
Absolutely. I mean, I think especially in this one, I was really um, thinking a lot about quilts at the time and thinking about quilt patterns. I feel like it's one of the kind of textile histories that feels sort of in my DNA, both in terms of like having family members who have practiced this, but it being this kind of long-standing African American tradition, thinking about improvisation. And I set out in this body of work for a show called Arc of Bulrushes to kind of mine the myths and stories about quilts being a very important tool to navigate to freedom through the Underground Railroad.
Yeah.
Um, and I wanted to then sort of like use these quilt patterns to think about that kind of liberatory frequency that's been embedded in the practice of quilting, and allow these figures to kind of um, make space out of the quilt patterns as opposed to it just being pictorial. Um, and I was looking at a lot of these kinds of histories of escape, how folks maybe crafted their own like route to freedom. In particular, I was thinking about Henry Box Brown, who was a man who um, literally mails himself to freedom, basically like
Yeah.
puts himself in a box, ships
Mm,
himself north of the Mason-Dixon line. And so using this kind of North Star quilt pattern to kind of evoke maybe the opening up of a box, having this figure kind of like explode outward, but also it is the North Star, or it's supposed to be a symbol for it. So like having this figure kind of come out of a star. There are all these ways that I was trying to, I think, take multiple stories, look at them from all these angles, and then make these kind of composite images like you see here. But I think there's like a lyricism I'm always interested in finding in the poses, in the bodies, um, to maybe find ways to transform content that might otherwise be sort of like dark and be read as dark, and I think people miss maybe the thread that I'm most interested in is that kind of self-possession or like means to mm, articulate your own sort of story.
yeah. Self-possession is such a perfect term for it. And I
Mm,
do feel like, I mean, hearing you describe that jumping out of the box, Jack in the Box like
hmm hmm
so what could be read as a stress position is then reread as a act of self-liberation. I know people ask you this all the time, probably, but there's an immediate thought that arises because most of these figures are black male and sort of maybe your build, ish. There's a of course a question about how much of this is self-portraiture, and even when we see a triple, the kind of triptych,
Yeah.
it is also very interestingly built into the structure of this work. 3 textiles that have been made one.
hmm
This question of how much of this is looking at Diedrick Brackens and how much of it is looking at some more general persona. Could you speak to that question of portraiture and self-portraiture?
Absolutely. Thank you. It's a great, I do get asked this all the time, but that was a great way of asking. um, I think I have learned no matter what I say, it always becomes me. So I try to deal with that in the studio because I know that people, no matter what I say, are like, "Oh my God, you know, this is your life story narrated out in these images," and I'm sort of like, I've never done any of these things, or you know, like that's not true. But like most of these images, I'm like, I have not been in this kind of situation with an animal or you know whatever. But I think sometimes it is me trying to mythologize my own life, like use these symbols to talk about something I may have experienced or, you know, can imagine experiencing. Um, but what I have taken away from literature and poetry, especially poetry, is that, you know, often when you're discussing someone's poem or you're discussing your own poem, you say, you know, the speaker of this poem, you know, so I think about a lot of these images as like, you know, the character in this weaving, the proposition here, um, as a way to make room for myself to make what I need to make and not question, you know, whether or not it's true to my life. But I think of them as like a stand-in for people who might share any number of experiences with me, the maker, being able to sort of like inhabit them, right? Like I think folks who live in spaces where there are lighthouses, people who have some relationship to horses or the rural landscape, um, anyone who has like said the Pledge of Allegiance. Like I think there's a wide group of people who can read these images, see themselves in them, whether or not it's coming from directly my vantage point or you know the figures are based on my silhouette, et cetera, et cetera. um I hope there's enough there that people sort of like don't feel that it's diaristic, right? Like that there is room for other folks to make sense of themselves and looking at the objects.
Yeah. Maybe a useful word to introduce here would be archetype, which is, you know, uh, in this case, the figure is archetypal.
Hmm.
And the
Hmm.
blackness, I
Hmm.
think, here is also important that it is manifestly a shape into which projection can happen. Um, and
Absolutely.
and you've already talked about myth. I'm sure we'll get more into this, but myths are told about specific characters, and the whole point of them is that we do relate to them, or we find in them shapes to graft onto our own life to understand ourselves better. I mean, for me, that's sort of
Hmm.
that's what it's for. That's where it comes from. And so that question of the archetypal, I think, is highly relevant to your work, not just in the figures, but also everything else. So the way
Yeah.
that you deal with landscape, the way that you deal with animals. Could you talk a little bit about that question of the mythic archetype and how you choose the iconography from that point of view?
Yeah, absolutely. Man, that's good. There are, I mean, I think this one with the red tree is maybe a good place to think about
Mhm.
myth and archetype. Um, I think I'm always entering, you know, relatively into um there might not be oh yeah, there is. uh so Jesus, it's so hard to like unravel my own thoughts. But so I guess I'm starting with thinking about Hercules and the 12 labors. So the god Hera assigns the Hercules, bastard son of Zeus, the task to, you know, do all of these heroic feats, and then he will become a god, be immortal, get entry into Greek, whatever, whatever. I'm not telling this story well, but I promise I know it. I'm just shorthanding.
Long story.
um, and so, two of the tasks he has to face multi-headed dogs. One of which I cannot remember his name because he's not as famous as he's got two heads, and the other has three heads, which is Cerberus, the dog of hell. I'm thinking about European tapestries, um, 15th, 16th century tapestries, which essentially often depict dogs. And what these dogs are often signaling is that they are on the hunt for some heroic or mythological creature, often like a lion, a griffin, a unicorn, etc.
Mm,
Um, and then I'm starting to think about American history, where like what dogs have done in the New World is hunt and chase people, often Black folks, folks of color, police land, keep people in or out, et cetera, et cetera. And so I basically like make these things and I'm trying to layer all of these stories at once together, um, to think about like if these are sort of the source codes that I'm given, like how do I make sense of them? How do I relate to them? What relevancy do they have to me
mm,
today and in the like sort of recent past? And and thinking about like if a dog is its job is to signal the hunt, like what would a dog in a tapestry be signaling the hunt of, like in this particular like a moment time in my life, or in history, not just my life. Yeah, and so then I mean, again, there's like a North Star in this. So I'm trying to take all of these kind of myths, well-known stories, et cetera, and collapse them to maybe start to like carve out a different narrative in that grand narrative that we are sort of taught to believe. And like if there are stories, um, if there's like a moral of the story, right, for this Greek myth, I don't think it at the end of the line means the same thing to me that it might mean to my straight white differently bodied counterpart. And so I'm trying to like open those stories up to be like, well, like this is maybe how I relate to this, or like this is the fallout between um a historical story, myth, or uh legend, or Bible
mm,
story, et cetera, et cetera.
mm. I feel like that's such an important part of the generosity of the work. So speaking as a straight white viewer, I feel like the palimpsest of different mythological references and codes that you're putting into the work give you all of these different avenues into it. And actually, my partner Nicola Stephanie, who's a painter, pointed out to me earlier that there's also a way of reading your work in relation to Greek vase painting and the kind of storytelling with black figure vases, which
Mhm,
hadn't occurred to
mhm,
me because, of
mhm.
course, you're weaving, but there's that ceramic precedent as well. So that overlay of ancient Mediterranean mythology, like Golden Bough style, right, with African American vernacular mythology that we might associate with an artist like Kara Walker, for example. And, as you said, collapsing them or layering them on top of one another, it feels to me like there is an incredible, as I said, a kind of generosity there, because it's like you're making all of those stories available and mutually relevant in a way that is unusual. I feel like they're often held apart and maybe even held to be oppositional in some ways. And so there's a
Yeah,
kind of possibly even a kind of universalism or universal framework of relevance that happens from that multiplicity of storytelling. Um, so that's how I feel it. But I wonder for you, like as a researcher, when you're putting those stories together, do you find that yourself recognizing those correspondences and feeling like it's all the same big story, or does it feel more like a collage? How is that process for you?
absolutely. I think it's a dance between either one of those poles. Like sometimes, it's like I think we all maybe absorb the same information. We've read the same books, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't think we always come out with the same sort of like, this is what it means. So I'm very curious in that part. Like
Mm,
what does it mean? Like how do we read symbols? How do we read language, legend, myth? Um, and I don't know. I feel like we've gone to a movie, we've all seen it, and then everyone loves it, and you're like, am I the only person who realizes this is problematic? Am I the only person who hates, this, or like thought that actress was terrible? And I feel like that's where some of my impulse comes from when I see or read a thing and I'm like, oh, I am having a divergent view, or like I see a crack in this to exploit. Um, yeah, so sometimes I'm just making, thinking, and I think as that's happening, meaning is being shaped. Like as I literally weave, I'm like, oh, like here's another sort of thing. Here's another thing. This is another interest. How do I like point people towards this?
I wonder if we should get into weaving for a minute as a medium specific conversation. So there's a lot to say about this, and you've been weaving for, well, a long time because you started when you were an undergraduate, right? That was when you first encountered it in
Yeah,
Texas. Am I remember that rightly?
absolutely. Yeah.
So, there's obviously the technical question of how the image is assembled and how it accumulates, and then particularly when you're working large, as in the case with this, well, both of these works that we're looking at now, there's also this question of the internal seams and the kind of smash joints that happen because you're putting together these lengths and composing one image out of these separate durational strips of time and making. And when you were just talking about the kind of frictional elements, like you go to the movie and you're like, am I alone here? Am I the person that is radically dissatisfied by the ideology or performance that I'm being confronted with? Um, I wonder whether there's a way that those internal edges and the kind of also the kind of juddering, slightly out of step, out of phase quality that you sometimes get with weaving sort of speak to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think those like fractures or misregistrations,
Mm,
um, especially, yeah, they're on the upper left.
mhm.
Um, I do think speak to this kind of like psychological sort of friction or fracturing or what the word I want is for it. But yeah, I think that there is a space where it sort of like lets in or accounts for that kind of like imperfect read or like that the kind of space that we find ourselves in sometimes, where it is not a sort of like a it's more of a composite always for me than it is kind of one unified,
Mm.
easy to read story.
Yeah. Well, there's also the stepping of the fringe in both this work and the last one we were looking at, and that sense that the edge is uh, the coordinates of that edge are uncertain, right? Like where does it
Mhm,
work starting
mhm.
and stopping? Um, and of course, there's also the fact that you're working in a medium that's so often associated with domesticity and a kind of warmth and coziness, and there's that like what would happen if you threw a Diedrick Brackens on your bed kind of question latent in your mind, right? And for me, that yeah, someone just put in the post in the chat, frayed and experience, which is a great way of putting it. But that fraying and irregularity of the edge also maybe distances it a little bit from that domestic textile realm, even though it's still quite present.
Yeah, no, for me, they're always the like reference I have is I don't know that everyone does this, but you like I have old rags that you can't get rid of them because they're like you have to do things with an old rag that you can't do with like the towel you put out for your guest or like you clean your sink with it, you wash your car with it. It's got like all these purposes. Um, and so I'm interested in the kind of way that although like new, these feel like they've been around, they've seen some things. And there is like a textile base that they can inhabit. And when I think about function, right? Like we have raggedy textiles, but they serve a really important function in our lives. But even beyond that, I think that there is, as you, Glenn, will be familiar with. Like I think I'm, a child of the kind of sloppy craft moment, movement, impulse. And I feel I cannot articulate this better than saying I don't think that's exactly the only place that that impulse comes from, but and I feel as though like myself and peers are sort of like a step out of that moment, but like definitely responding to it. And for me, it's there is an impulse to return to mediums like ceramics or textiles, the hand, and I think that the way that you are taught and the way that most people look at these things is like the if a maker can erase their hand, its marks, its movements, like that is kind of excellence.
Mm.
And for me, that kind of like worn, heavy-handed, kind of like you know that someone made this quality um, is something that I'm like always conscious of keeping in the work.
Mm. Probably we should give some love to Josh Fott, who was
Yes.
he actually coined the phrase sloppy craft. So that's one reason. But he also was a professor of yours at California College of the Arts, formerly
Yes,
California College
yes,
of
yes.
Crafts. And I feel like the point of that phrase sloppy crafts is really, it's not even so much to do with a refusal of skill. It's more like an embrace of immediacy, like a wanting to say I am here, fully
Hmm.
present in this work.
Hmm.
And so
Hmm.
that self erasure that you're describing that does happen with very elite levels of skill um, can be self effacing in other ways as well, right? So the
Right.
idea would be by allowing ourselves to enjoy the approximate craftsmanship, or however we might describe it, of something that's a
Yeah.
rough images, you also get more of the person there, you know,
Hmm.
works and all. Have you found it difficult? I was just thinking about something um, a former student of mine once told me. She was working for Tracy Emin, and she said that, and she was actually a seamstress or embroiderer for Tracy
Hmm.
Emin, and she said that she herself, working in the studio, felt like Emin's work lost a lot when she started to have other people working on the projects with her, because her hand and in a way the ineptness of her hand was so crucial
Hmm.
to the work.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
And whether one agrees with that or not, I wonder if you found yourself in a conversation with yourself about your own skill and how to manage it as you've become more necessarily more proficient, more experienced, and making obviously a lot more work to obviously fill a space like this too is a pressure and an issue. So how do you kind of deal with all that?
Absolutely. I think this is a great slide for that question. In part, I think it's been about trying to set the terms around my exhibition schedule, which like
Mm.
I have, mm, a tenuous relationship with success at doing that. But I think, for instance, this show 2024, my last show at Jack Timmy was 2021. So I think I was able to give myself a lot of space to think about what the work was, where it was going, what I was excited about, and not have sort of the pressure of like, oh, there's another show coming in the next, 18 months or 9 months or whatever. Um, but in these works, like the sort of um, red orb on the left and the red figure on the right. For me, these are ways that I've sort of like pushed into potentially new territory, allowed myself to kind of crack a question I've been having around kind of transparency and how light moves through
Mm.
a weaving. Like I think that there are things that I was trying to get weaving to articulate and I did not know how. And in that sort of in this 3-year period, I've been able to kind of articulate possibilities that I don't think I would have been able to if I was sort of like, facing the gauntlet of
Yeah.
always showing and producing new work. Um, and I mean, so there is, I don't know if we can like dig this image out, but there's an image with that's 3 panels, 2 horses. There's like, yeah, that one. So like this, between this work and that work with that red orb that I was talking about, just I've been able to sort of pursue something with that orb and like realize it in a different way than I was immediately able to. So this image is probably from uh, a work from I think last year, maybe, but like in conceptualization, this is maybe a 2-year-old work, I guess. So I've just been able to find ways to kind of keep my hand in it, but like continue to push what the kind of visual aesthetic language is. And I will say, like, I do work with a team of 3, so like there is always I do have that anxiety around like, what are they doing over there? Is this like moving away from what I would do or like towards something new and interesting? Um, and I will say, in the case of the 3 folks who work in the studio, 2 of them are kind of former students, one of whom I've been working with for like 6 years. So I think we have kind of share my brain between the 2 of us at this point. But yeah, there are times and days where the work is ahead of me, where like regardless of what I want to do, there are 3 other people who are kind of charging ahead and I have to sort of grapple with and account for that.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, I've encountered so many artists where that is the case, that the work is a machine that continues to drive forward no matter how you're feeling.
hmm
Certainly
hmm
that process, particularly when the work is as intensely personal as yours is, I can
Yeah.
really sympathize with that. Um, but I'm also just interested to hear you talk about finding these forms of sophistication that don't have to do just with tightness or some conventional sense of what a proper weaving, quote unquote, should look like. And it feels to me almost like you're thinking as a painter would in terms of palette, transparency, mark making, those classic painterly concerns, which are not
Yeah.
necessarily of weaving, but it feels to me like you're weaving in a way that really brings forward some of those sensual aspects that we go to painting for.
Absolutely. I feel like this is a probably only contentious to me. I don't think that's true. Um, I have kind of staked my ground on something that I can't back away from at this point, which is weaving. And uh, I don't know how to say it. What folks who I have been in conversations with for the entirety of my career and education have always said to me is that, well, you should just think of weaving as like a means to an end. Like, yeah, you weave, but you're a painter. Essentially, is what I've been told for a very long time, um, and it irks me. But I will also say that like I went to 2 educational institutions, University of North Texas, California College of the Arts, that in a lot of ways put me directly into conversation with folks who um, were not making in this discipline. Like they were not necessarily weavers. And so I was always around people who approached um, their discipline or their object, often painting, in a radically different way than I ever thought about weaving, right? And I think that the questions that they would ask around sort of like, they would approach a peer's painting and they'd look at the edge that they'd painted and they'd be like, oh, wow, you turned this into an object. It's no longer a flat
Yeah.
surface. And I was like, to me, that was like a radical assertion. I was just like, wait, what? Like, this is what y'all talk about and think about? This is crazy. And just the way they approached color and thought about, how one might materialize a painting in different, um, not on a canvas, not on a panel, like that was radical to them. And to me, all of these things were exciting. Um, and it sort of added to my toolkit. And I think it did reshape the way I thought about weaving, right? So like I did care about like what was chief and primary to weaving, which was a lot around the hand and excellence and what the back of your weaving might look like to show that you were, a good craftsperson. Um, but I could sort of then layer on top of that all of these questions around like how you move the eye across the composition, what color might do to a viewer, et cetera, et cetera. That weren't like they just weren't the concerns in any kind of textile conversation that I was having.
But the part where you got irked when people would say, "Oh, weaving is just a mean to an end," is because it was kind of disrespecting the actual métier that you were involved with.
I think so, and I think it is the kind of thing where like people don't really care about the process. Not that they don't, but it's like, okay, I don't want to get bogged down in talking about twill and how many harnesses your loom has and whatever. All I know is I like the way it looks. And I think for me it was like, well, yeah, you do because it's it is inherently woven. Like you just don't have enough of a relationship to understand. Whereas like we all have some conception of what painting is like. We kind of know what happens in the studio when someone closes the door to some extent. Whereas I think with weaving, people are like, I can't wrap my head around this.
Yeah. Don't
um,
don't you think there's also just maybe a residual prejudice about, I think most people are over the medium-based hierarchy now, but I think
yeah,
there's a residual prejudice that um, there's almost no incentive to inform ourselves about these craft processes, or that talking about it still does somehow drag the work down or demean it. Like you start talking about heddles and it's like, well, no, no, that's not the point. Where you start talking
yeah,
about paint in a
absolutely.
technical way,
I
it's still
do
fascinating and informative, and that's obviously something we should get over.
absolutely.
That's definitely still.
Yeah, I do feel like the divide has collapsed, but I do think that yeah, there are still some like lingering sort of prejudices. Like we are comfortable seeing ceramics and textiles in this space, but we don't necessarily want all the like maybe what people might think of as baggage.
Yeah. Should we just shift tack for a second and talk about some of the literary sources in the show? So I know Octavia Butler is one of the sources. One of the titles of the work is "Mind of My Mind," and then
Mhm.
we might also read a poem, or you might read a poem. So this is Wendy Vidalach's "How You Might Approach a Foal," which is a very beautiful short poem. So maybe
Yeah,
could we start with having a reading of that, and then
absolutely.
talk a little bit about the literary energies that are coursing into the show.
Absolutely. So there is a work that shares that title. It's the blue one with the horses. There might not be might just be an install shot of that one. I'm not sure. It's that yeah, 47. Sweet. Thank you. So this poem, How You Might Approach a Foal, is the title of the poem by Wendy Vidlach. Um, inspires a lot of the work in the exhibition, I'd say, but this is a good kind of landing spot for it. How you might approach a foal, like a lagoon, like a canoe, like you are part earth and part moon, like deja vu, like you had never been to the outer brink or the inner loop, like hay, like air, like your mother just this morning had combed a dream into your hair. Like you had never heard a sermon or a harsh word, like a fool, like a pearl, like you are new to the world.
So nice. It's got this wonderful incantatory rhythm that is very much like weaving. I was actually just by happenstance, I was talking to Indira Allegra, the artist who's poet and weaver. I know
Hmm.
they were saying that when they first encountered a loom, they were like, "Oh, I can deal with this. This is because I know how to do lines," and just thinking poetry as wefts and a warp
Yeah,
of the kind of spiritual or emotional space. And that poem really, really does that beautifully. What captivated you about it and inspired you to make a work in its image?
um, I think in part, like that poem teaches me so many things, and a lot of it is just like how to be in relationships with people, both romantic and business, et cetera, et cetera. I think there's just like a tenderness that I strive for and like want to sort of embody in my life and in the work. Um, and horses are these things that I think about a lot, both in terms of um, I think I'm like captivated by. I want to be a horse girl in my mind. I think like of myself as like this person who's like obsessed with them and would ride every weekend. But I'm terrified of horses. I've tried to ride. I've ridden horses, and I'm just like I need to get down. I need to get down. And I think the way that they kind of manifest in the American landscape, mine, and history, like that they are the most important tools to like the colonial project. They are how we quickly like got across the land and moved people around, asserted boundaries, et cetera, et cetera. And so like I try to never depict a person riding a horse, but trying to have this kind of like um, more equal relationship to each other. And maybe there's something about my fear of being on top of a horse, or like asserting myself in any way against another creature. Um, but I think for me, even I often think about the animals in the work as just other people or psychological states one might find themselves in, and trying to assert this kind of like even relationship where like you allow the thing that you really want to come to you as opposed to sort of going out and like wrestling it down, which is how I think we think about success in our careers and our relationships and like how we move through the world often. um yeah, but I think it's just this kind of like call or like quest for like a particular kind of tenderness that I'm always thinking through, and this poem, this piece sort of like maybe start to like gesture towards that.
Yeah. I feel like the horse is the perfect emblem for that because it fluctuates across so many different spaces. Like it is the sentimental poster on the kid's wall, right?
Hmm, hmm.
Also is, as you say, essentially the M1 Abrams tank of its day, right? Like rolling across the West and prosecuting a genocide. And then it
Hmm,
is also this
hmm.
emblem of freedom, which is how you're using it really. Um, because yeah, it hadn't occurred to me before, but your horses are always saddleless and no bit in their mouth, and they're always riding free. And then the question of the figure's freedom is maybe more fraught. So
Hmm.
the horse seems like a kind of aspirational emblem, perhaps, especially in this one where you have this kind of cascade of them going past in this reclining figure. And
Yeah,
then like, yeah, yeah. Um, I would love to talk a little bit more about freedom, and I think for that it would be good to see that flag piece that is highly unusual um, in your practice. And I feel like maybe this is an inevitable question to ask, but what is it like for you making work like this at this time? Not specifically in an election year, given everything that we know, but you know, to delve into these deep wells of Americana, which is one of the things that you're drawing from,
yeah,
at an American identity itself is so unbelievably fractious and contested. And I mean, to me, this work brings so much of that into focus and compresses those questions. So I'd love to hear you talk about it a little bit if you can.
absolutely. I don't know how linearly I can do that, which I probably haven't done on any of the questions. But I feel like the way I would maybe start it is like a double negation, right? Like I am not an American. Like there is those
Mhm.
concerns are always um, the like shared burden of anyone who calls this place home.
Mm.
Um, and what else would I say? So I maybe in 20, I don't know my own CV. It was either 2017 or 2019, and those are two radically ways to get it wrong. I had a show in um, Tennessee at Sewanee University, University of the South. And so for those who don't know, it was like originally like a bastion for the Confederacy to send their sons and daughters to be educated. And it has been doing a lot of the work to sort of dismantle that history and make good on all the ways that maybe it got things wrong. But I had a show there called Allegiance, which um, at the time I was making a lot more abstract work, not as much of the kind of figurative works that I was making. And I live with the conviction that textiles can speak, like that they have language embedded in them. Uh, and if not speak, they can be read. Like I think people can look at color, shape, line, and come away with meaning, language. Um, and one of those ways that we sort of read textiles every day is by looking at flags of any nation, country, group, religion, and knowing what those symbols mean. So even here, I'm confident that people read this as an American flag, whether or not it's abstracted. Um, and I think even when it's not this and it's these other images in my body of work, like there is a kind of Americana that is like overlaid um, in looking at textiles. Um, and yeah, we hung this show, and there was a moment where we discussed maybe putting this in, maybe not. And in this kind of, I don't know what we would call this architectural style. In this architectural style, in this particular place in New York that is directly across the street from a courthouse, where there have been protests, where there is currently a Trump trial going on. Like I think it took on meaning that I I did not specifically bring or intend, but I think this happens. This happens in any place you sort of erect an American flag. Like all of these kind of violences and contemporary and historical things come to like be laid at the feet of. So I guess to me it is like it's inherently political to like bring an American flag into one's work, but also like it's always going to take on the meaning of like whatever is happening at the moment and in the place. And so there's that to grapple with.
Yeah, and this does feel like not a flag, as you were saying, not
Hmm. Hmm.
one thing that's very interesting about it is that of course it doesn't have stars, it has the checkerboard instead, which is much more of a textile move. And obviously
Hmm.
stars are difficult to weave,
Yeah.
compared to checkerboard. So there's a kind of expediency to it, and it's like a translation into the technical repertoire, but also obviously the narrowing, this kind of feeling of constriction.
Yeah.
I see somebody put in the chat also that it made them think of a shawl. It's kind of an interesting reference, and it does, it could be a table runner, it could be lots of things besides a flag, you know.
Yeah. So I think it's the most maybe flexible work of all. In its original sort of incarnation, it was used and shown as if to be a table runner. So like I imagine as it moves through the world and it's shown, it does different
Mm.
things in other iterations.
Yeah, it's amazing to hear you talk about how the world keeps coming at the object, though. So things that you didn't put into the object happen to the object and accumulate meaning, and vice versa.
Yeah.
I think that's something we could say about a lot of your work. It might be worth just having a moment about the space, the Shaneman's space. So folks have been seeing this incredible setting, and it's worth, yeah, let's see some of the um, yeah, incredible shots of this space. And this is really the first time that it's been fully occupied for presenting art. And you were saying that Nick Cave will have a show there this fall as well. So that's super
Yeah.
exciting, obviously. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if
Um,
that's public knowledge, but I mean, I'm sure it is. I'm okay getting in,
it is
in
now.
trouble.
Sorry. But
I'm sure it is. Um,
it's okay. This is only the most important art platform in the country that we're talking about. So one reason I wanted to bring that up is just so people know that this amazing space is there to be seen. But also, I did want to ask you about what it means to show with Shainman and talk about the gallery a little bit, because it's quite a remarkable presence in the art landscape. And I feel like often we don't talk about galleries and what their personalities and histories are. Like that's so
Yeah.
bad. But I think with Jack, it feels like there's a larger project in which you are embarked if you are showing in that space. And I wonder what it means to you to be showing with Shainman specifically and showing this work specifically with Shainman.
Absolutely. This is a good place to end because I will gush and like it's embarrassing a little bit, but I'm like I'm not embarrassed, but I'm sure um it's a lot. I the first time I ever learned who Jack Shaman was, it was because I'd been essentially like a student of so many of the artists that he represents, and it sort of finally like got to this point where I learned that this man represented so many of these folks. So like before I knew there was a Jack Shaman, I knew there was an Ella Natsui. Before I knew there was a Jack Shaman, I knew there was a Nick Cave. Before I knew there was a Kerry James Marshall. And so I think there were so many artists that I later learned that the gallery was representing, that I was just like, okay, I graduated undergrad in 2011. And then that summer, I took my sort of inaugural trip to New York City to like see the art world. And the very first place that I went was Jack Shaman Gallery. And at the time, they had a Leslie Wayne show on. I think it was in the 24th, no, it was in 20th Street. And I like went through the show and like looked at everything. And then like thereafter, I like followed the gallery, looked at what they were doing, was always curious. Um, and, I go to grad school, they're like, you should never be, over eager to show at a gallery that you like, because you never know if you're a great fit. And so I never thought about galleries as like, this will be the place that will be, that I'm gonna like strive for. And then in 2018, time is weird, I don't know. 2019, I've like met Jack at um the Studio Museum Gala. He came up and like shook my hand, congratulated me on winning the Joyce Win Prize that night. And then he said his name, and I was like, "Oh, that's Jack Shaman." And then, a year or two later, a director there, Joanna Bellarado Samuels, who is, in the center of my heart, um, called me out of the blue and was like, "Do you want to work with the gallery?" And I was like, um, yeah, like sure. And so I think it's this like long held dream that I did not realize I had. Um, and in the sort of having the work in this new space, is something that I'm still processing, in part because the show was never conceptualized to be in this space. Very late in the process of getting ready to install at 20th Street, Jack called me and was like, I really love these new works. Like, we would not be able to show them at 20th Street because they're so large. Like, I think we should split the show in half and take some of it to Lafayette so that we can, show these new works. Um, and like this is not something that I think anyone would say no to. And something that I can say I've had a long dream of doing is like one day showing works in a castle, and I feel like this is almost it gets me close. Like this is my like New York Palazzo moment. Um, and it feels so strange to see the work hold its own in this space and seemingly be um conceptualized for the space.
Yeah.
Like that is still my great surprise. Um,
No, it feels
yeah.
meant. This is actually a really good shot for this point, but it's obviously of astounding proportions, this space, and very ornate, and
Hmm.
feels like it more than holds its own. It feels like it almost validates the space and makes the space okay in a way that
Hmm.
might not if the work were different, because it's like that space which is so, you know, so rich on in every sense of that term, is serving the work rather than the other way around, which I feel like
Yeah.
is important. So it's a great choice. And I'm just glad we're having this conversation about the gallery, because again, I feel like galleries, people complain about galleries a lot for starters, but including people that work at galleries. But I feel like they do so much, and particularly Shaneman, but there are many others who have really moved the conversation forward in this way that it doesn't always get recognized. So it's not just commerce, it's also, a lot of passion and commitment and,
Yeah. Yeah.
like,
No, the team at the gallery, Jack included, have been very good stewards of the work and really, I think, a lot of artists' careers, frankly, that um, it's like my great joy to be a part of it.
yeah, yeah, it's an ecosystem. So I see that Eleanor is back on the screen, which maybe suggests that we should be moving to Q&A. Diedrick, this has been an amazing conversation. I'm curious to know what other people would like to ask.
Yeah, this has been truly incredible. Thank you so much, Glenn and Diedrick, for this. So inspiring. We've got some great questions from the audience today. And our first question is from Oriane, and I will allow you to unmute to ask.
Okay. Hi.
Yeah.
Hi, Diedrick. Great to hear this whole discussion. I have kind of two comments. One is the horses. I know that you're from Texas, and I kind of assumed that you had some like real relationship with horses, just because I'm like a northern city person, and I'm like, oh, Texas, yeah, he rides, whatever, that you had some specific, that was part of your specific, history, your iconography. But when you said it's more of a like a symbolic or a metaphorical thing, it reminded me of in Marilyn Monroe's last movie, The Misfits, where she joins this kind of band of like kind of outsider guys who, they don't have regular day jobs, and they go on this trip, and I think it was called wildcatting, something like that. And she was like, yeah, I'm going to go and wildcat with you guys. And then she realizes when they go that what that meant was finding wild horses and basically breaking them, taming them, and in a kind of a violent, awful way to make them, I don't know, usable, saleable, tools. And that she has this like total freak out breakdown, screaming, like you're killing them, and like they kind of stop and say, oh yeah, like it was very human moment where she just thought wildcatting horses, cool, fun, and that her reaction changed the whole like dynamic. And so I guess it's not really a question. It's more like I'm reacting to, like, I assumed I knew what horses meant to you, but then it's like this whole different thing. So it makes me think about your iconography in another way. So
Yeah,
I guess,
absolutely. I mean, I think also I love that question, or I love the statement too. I do think a lot about the ways, like in this particular set of works, I mean, there's a pig that seems as though it might be about to be stabbed. There's a deer that is dead. There's a rabbit that's head's about to be pulled off. And something that I know that is unique to humans, my fellow humans, is that we freak out over the way, and not that we should not, the ways that other humans treat animals. Like our hearts go out to an animal so fast in a way that,
then to another human. Yeah.
in the way that we don't for our fellow human. And that is something that I'm very like keenly interested in and aware of, especially when like crafting images that I want to try to, yeah, I don't know, like leave space for the tenderness for animals and also use it as a means to get people to think about like how we don't necessarily maybe see each other.
Good point.
Yeah.
My other question, sort of comment, I guess, was about when you said people say, oh, but you're really a painter, like weaving is just the way you do it. But I mean, that just shows to me their limited view of what weaving is, and even the history. I mean, medieval European tapestries are all narrative and animals and stories.
Yep.
Like, I mean, how do you? I just think they're saying your work doesn't include or doesn't encompass, my limited view of weaving, and like, how do you? I guess you kind of already answered it after I asked it in the chat, but like, how do you respond to that and deal with that? I mean, as a fellow weaver, I hear that too.
Yeah. No, I think I'm always interested in how far along I can bring people. Like, to me, it is like I think what I also mean to say is like I've accepted the burden of like bringing people more textile information as a part of the practice. Like, in addition to making images that like I'm interested in and using this materiality to do it, like, yes, there are times where I do have to be like, okay, this is a double woven cloth, and like that's what this means, and that's what this allows for, and that's, you have probably seen that in this kind of domestic setting. This is a supplemental warp and weft, and like that's what this means, that's what this allows for in this image making. And these are the constraints that I'm like working in, and it, like, look right there, that's what's very exciting and hard to do. And I do think it has helped, and I also think that there are, like you and myself, there are way more folks in the foreground doing the work of weaving in very complex and different ways. And I hope that that is like reorienting, re-educating people towards a textile um, discipline, materiality. And I think people are like, relearning, like, oh yeah, I guess there's this relationship I have through family, through friends. I've seen a loom before, et cetera, et cetera. More than I've ever experienced now in the last 5 years. People are like, yeah, I know about weaving. And I'm like, oh wow, that's cool.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that question. The next question will be from Ty.
Hey, well, thank you, Diedrick. Thanks, Glenn, for this conversation. I was wondering, when you were talking about the Vidalog poem and you were showing the work that you made. I mean, I know you said a lot of the work comes from that, but I was thinking about what your relationship might be, or how you would speak to your relationship with poetry in relation to whether you see it as an ekphrastic practice or like more of a representational imagery kind of a thing, and how you
Um,
think about that.
I appreciate that question so much. Yeah, so I think I'm loath to admit often I write poetry. So I feel like I'm a frustrated poet, and I think the early on, and one of the many roads that I thought I would take, I'm sure like many people, I was like, I'm going to be a writer. I was going to be a biologist because I wanted to be a botanist. There's a way that I think most of the career paths I thought I would take sort of um, have this relationship to the land, to animals, to a natural world. Um, and I think often a lot of the things that I'm making are manifesting inside my head in both languages, if that makes any sense. Like, I'm thinking through language and lyric as much as I'm thinking through, string and warp and weft. And I think it's a competition in that kind of like decision moment where, am I going to write about it or am I going to weave it? And I think there are times where I do both, and there are times where I'm like, I can't image this, or I can't write this. But and there's this etymological link between sort of the idea of weaving and writing, or making in poetry. Like, they both share this idea of like writing but materiality. And so I think, to me, it seems natural that like my hands and mine are are struggling and fighting with each other about how it manifests. So yeah, sometimes I will make a thing and then I'll write about it or whatever. I think sometimes the title maybe is the small pocket for language.
Mm.
And then sometimes I back into the one that I did not start with, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think, I don't know, with weaving and poetry, the line is really interesting. Like what you do with the line and how you feel it and like where it goes. But yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Amazing question, Ty. Thank you, Diedrick, for that beautiful answer. I have a question I'd like to ask.
Oh,
Yeah, I'm wondering how you think about light in your work, considering the way that figures are mostly rendered as silhouettes.
um, I man, I feel like I never have an easy answer. Um, Often, not always, I'm thinking about nighttime, and I think that that allows me to do things with color that aren't literal and that maybe are more surreal, and they open up the space of kind of um, interiority that I think comes with being awake at night or being out in the world at night, like the kind of fantastical um, thing is awakened. So because I guess because of these kind of nightscapes, I'm allowed or allow myself to do things with the light that maybe are mm, exaggerations of like what moonlight does on a body of water or does to the sky, or allow these orbs of light to be kind of mm, super bright and powerful. So I think it's like this thing between color and light for me, where I'm sort of like thinking about hues and values relative to often like an interior emotional register. Um, and I think being from Texas and being in California, I think the kind of like low horizon, big sky of Texas and like what happens with color and light in those environments is always in the work, but also now living here, like, like every sunset is better than the last, like the ways that color and light splash in the sky in California and like Northern California light versus Southern California light are two radically different things. And again, this is like the sort of painter in me probably that's like, yeah, the green line in the sky at night or the blue hour, cast everything in this beautiful light, et cetera, things that I do take to the loom.
It's worth mentioning, Dietrich, that the works in the show include works that were conceived as being at dusk or noon or night, so they kind of clock in, right? Which is, if you think about Monet and his haystacks or something, right? So your
Yeah,
function is like
yeah.
doing
And I feel
light.
like there's the most color, the highest range of color seems most available to me in the natural world at dusk. Like you look in the sky and you see like colors that you don't imagine when you think about a drawing of the sky.
That's so, so beautiful. Thank you for sharing
Yeah,
that.
of course.
I think our last question today will be from Chloe. So Chloe, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Diedrick and Glenn, for this conversation, which has been such a joy to listen to. Diedrick, I have two questions for you if you'll have them. The first one is how you think about scale relative to telling a story. Your works vary in scale so much, and it seems so integral to how you think about what you want to say with each composition. And so I'm curious to hear you talk about that.
Absolutely. So I tend to work at kind of a 6 foot square, 8 foot square parameter. And of course, things escalate outside of that size. But to me, I really like the story that I'm telling in each image to occur at almost life size or 75% or 1.1.5 size. because I want viewers to stand in front of it and feel like they're in it or like they're implicated in it. Like I think there's something about that one-to-one relationship to the body um, that makes them more palpable, like that like registers in the body, and keeping them close to the size of domestic textile, a bedspread or a curtain. Like there is, because you cannot touch them, I think somehow that full sizeness maybe accounts for that, like an inability to touch. At least you feel sort of engulfed in it. And I always insist on like hanging them as low as possible. I want it to feel like you can almost kind of walk into them, or the encounter of the body and the weaving seem closer to me.
And that's a great segue to the second question, which is, you talked a bit about this in a recent interview with Essence Harden, but I'd love to hear you speak a little bit about what the backs of the works say to you as the artist, especially because of Jack Shainman, some of the backs of the works are on view, and sort of how you think about the back versus the front. And
Yeah.
just would love to hear you talk a little bit about that.
In part, I like to show the backs because it allows people, whether or not they know how to weave, I think your mind can maybe more uneasily unpack construction and think about technique. And I think it is one of the places and ways that like the fact that it is woven gets privileged, that it is not a painting. Um, and I think weaving is inherently three-dimensional, but that doesn't always register, I don't think, if you can't sort of do this going around it, seeing how it is kind of put together. Um, and there's, they, depending on what I have woven, how I've woven the piece, the figures typically disappear on the back. So like you're often sort of, you have this moment of sort of maybe encountering a person in a landscape. But then if it's hung in space, you go around the back, there's no figure. So I like this kind of um, dance between kind of um, mm, I think that there is for me, I don't know how other people read this, there is a very emotional thing about someone disappearing from the landscape that I am trying, that I'm not trying to, that happens, that I did not account for when I first started weaving these things. But then to have that moment of like, it's just like a gut punch to me. Um, and the backs, um, because I am prioritizing the front, there are things that I might not weave on the back. And then the abstractions that happen on the back also get really exciting. Or I'll weave some junk yarn into the back. And then when I get to see the back, I'm like, oh my God, that's I could not have made that decision. Look at this beautiful weird thing. Um, Yeah. So there's just a lot on the backs that really I want people to be able to see them for these many reasons.
Thank you so much for those answers, Diedrick.
Yeah, of course.
Thanks for that question, Chloe. Thank you so much again, Glenn and Diedrick, for this amazing conversation. And I think we're gonna finish out with a reading from Diedrick now. So back over to you.
Okay. I'm just gonna read. I want not to like limit myself, but I'm going to read three short-ish things. And depending on if I have a second left, I might read one more thing. But I'll show the covers just so people can see what I'm reading from. And these are just a lot of things that have inspired me over the years, continue to inspire me that I come back to. But this is Horse in the Dark by Vivi Francis, who is born in Texas, not very far from where I was born, but at different times. So I will just jump into it. It is again Horse in the Dark by Vivi Francis. And the poem is called Anti-Pastoral. 1. How often have I spoken of the thistle, the honeysuckle, the blistering bees, How often have I asked how? I've grown tired of my questions, and you've grown tired of the limits of my language. I hate this measure of memory, the constant return to the creek, the field, the sundering south. I want to release from the pasture of my youth, from its cows and cobs in the mouth. Forgive my tiresome nostalgia, forget it. Let me forge a fissure between what was and is. I have no accent. You would not know where I was from if I didn't keep reminding you. Look at my city shoes crunching through the new snow on the sidewalk, not a blade of grass anywhere. Which is not to say praise the urban, privileged shadow of the alley over the shade beneath the tree or the average skyscraper over the clearing. Three. Not in a surfeit of emotion, but in this thoughtful consideration. Later, when natural rage through meditation may be pulled as milk through an udder into a purer stream, this is how Wadsworth would have it. Not red-eyed and trembling, but clear-headed, the tempest assuaged. Can you believe that? Easy to say from some green-lined walking trail, but this is a city, and here is an old woman on the curb, broken easily as a wafer. She might have had her iced tea later this evening. Here is a reason to prefer whiskey over a cow's poor offering. Whiskey, essential as water, worthy of pain and erasure. And she is one of many, so I drink to her and her and her. Patty Francis. I'm gonna read, okay, this first. Bestiary by Donica Kelly is one of my favorite books in the world. Great poet. I think that the recurring theme of these two is that they both are dealing with nature in their own particular ways, and I really love that. But this is a love poem. It's very short. Love poem, Centaur. Nothing approaches a field like me. Hard gallop, hard chest, hooves and mane and flicking tail. My love, I apprehend each flower, each winged body, saturated in a light that burnishes. I would make a burnishing of you, by which I mean a field in flower, by which I mean a breaching, my hands making an arrow of themselves, rooting the loosened dirt. I would make for you the barest of sounds, wing against wing. There, at the point of articulation, love, I pound the earth for you. I pound the earth. I love that poem. And I'll read, I got time to read one more. Yep, yep. So I feel like I have to read Essex Hemphill. This is Ceremonies. He is a Black queer poet who passed away in 1994 due to complications from AIDS. And I think he is the person who I've been in the longest, deepest conversation with, of course, across time and space. But he is the ghost that animates so much of my work. Okay. Rights and permissions. Sometimes I hold my warm seed up to my mouth, very close to my parched lips, and whisper, I'm sorry, before I turn my hand over the toilet and listen to the seed splash into the water. I rinse what remains down the drain, dry my hands. They return to their task as if nothing out of place has occurred. I go on being, wearing my shirts and trousers, voting, praying, paying rent, pissing in public, cussing cabs, fussing with utilities. What I learn as age advances, rentless Pillinger, is that we shrink inside our shirts and trousers, or we spread beyond the seams. The hair we cherished disappears. Sometimes I hold my warm seed up to my mouth and kiss it. Okay. Okay, I could read one more. Okay, I'm gonna read one more. Um, okay, so this is called To Wait and Want, and I wrote it. Um, 1. Chicken breast soaked in vanilla, aluminum foil and leather doused in WD-40. One day on a pack of green apple bubble gum, lured a large squirrel around a grapevine, lead tied to a plastic bag in a ring. With KFC wedge fries, caught a slew of medium blues. Hot dogs, raw bacon, clams. I whisper to the shells when no one is watching. Ivory soap for the prize. I ask a lot of questions. My father's replies come formed in clicks and whistles off his spinning reel. When fish guts are considered, I eat advice. The oilier, the better. If you fatten the current, it rises. 2. Cooked turkey tails, freezer burned salmon roe, starburst, moldy Swiss cheese, coagulated cow's blood chunks wrapped in pantyhose, drumsticks, scented candles, Big John's baked beans. This silver boat, unmanned, will drift towards my father's gates, for this is his realm, and I look spit out from his mouth. I bear 2 horns, one tumbles with offerings, both are woven of invisible richness between our hatch and match. 3. Garlic and chicken skin, spam, marshmallow, eggs and toothpaste, blackberries, mulberries, and cherry-flavored chicken, cuts of raw bird chilled for several days in vibrant Kool-Aid marinade. Stale blueberry glazed donuts, Slim Jims, goldfish, and jelly beans. Some folks even use opossum. Dough balls of every variety are always popular. One woman tells me anglers spit on nightcrawler backs. Does every child dream himself a prince? I watch my father rig and tackle dark things he thought the evening hid from my eyes, cleaning foul stuff he could not eat. His small smile could make blood dense and iridescent. 4. Remember, the most effective bait is hunger and calmness. Wait for the trick to take, holding the knowledge to wait. To want is to wait. Grip the burden of dreaming. We are still discovering the bounty of this lonely cistern. I am the misplaced half-god of lake and blue hour. I have not emerged too late from my father's sutured thigh. Delirious as we are to know one another, we bask, dumping strange potions into the depths. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diedrick. That was such a gift. What an amazing way to end this conversation and to end our week in the NSE. Thank you so much for your generosity.
Yeah. Thank y'all. I very much appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been so lovely and so magical today. Everyone, please do go see the show at Jack Shainman, 2 locations. Thank you so much, Glenn, again, for your great questions. And thank you to Adrian from Diedrick Studio and to Lydia and the team at Jack Shainman for supporting our preparations ahead of today. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and for their support of our growing archive, which you can explore on our YouTube channel and where this conversation will be posted very soon. And join us on Monday if you're free at 1 p.m. Eastern for an ode to Robert Moskowitz featuring Dieter Schwarz, Barbara McAdam, John Newman, Roger White, and Will Heinrich. Thanks all so much for tuning in today, and you can now turn on your microphone and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much again for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
So much.
Thank
Thank you, Jack.
Great reading.
Fantastic.
That was
Really,
amazing.
really wonderful. Thank
That's
you.
fun.